Well, how many times do I have to tell you? Exclaims the exasperated parent, teacher, wife, blank space for another character. Well, the first time I either didn't hear or I misheard and jumped to the wrong conclusion. The second time, I didn't understand and didn't want to admit it. The third time, I think I've got it. Well, I wonder, did Jesus get exasperated with his disciples? When I read that the disciples of Jesus mess it up, I take great comfort in that, because the disciples, after all, are human beings, just like you and me. They were fishermen, tax collectors, and other things. Okay, the context is different, but as a follower, as a disciple of Jesus in the 21st century, at the same time, I want to see that I don't make the same mistakes. So let's look at today's gospel passage. And the keen pew sheet readers among you would have noticed that we've added 3 preceding verses to what's set, because that story today is part of a much longer narrative going over 2 chapters. It starts further back, and it starts even before the transfiguration on that high mountain. Jesus and his disciples have been on a journey from Bethsaida, Caesarea Philippi, the mountain itself, through Galilee to Capernaum and into the region of Judea and across the Jordan, and now on their way up to Jerusalem. It's generally considered to be one continuous journey leading to Jesus' final days. It culminates in his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Now, if you read the whole of that narrative, you'll see that at least 3 times on this journey, Jesus has to take his disciples to one side. He patiently tells them what will happen to him when they get to Jerusalem, that the Son of Man will be betrayed, condemned to death and killed, and after 3 days rise again. 3 times Jesus has told them. Perhaps now the disciples have got it. But in my NIV version at home, verse 35 starts, then. Despite what Jesus has just said, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you." Now, if you're a parent, if your child comes to you and says, "Mum or Dad, I want you to do whatever I ask you," I think you might be suspicious or guarded, or maybe respond with some sort of caveat. That's my experience. But Jesus says, and I'm sure he says it in quite a pleasant way, "Well, what is it you want me to do for you? What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Appoint us to sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory." Well, no wonder then that the other 10 disciples, when they heard about this, became indignant, began to get angry with James and John. But I wonder whether their anger wasn't so much that it was James and John who thought they were better than the other 10, but they had got to Jesus first. Because, after all, it was only a short while ago when they had all been arguing about who was the greatest. You remember when Tom was here the other week, he referred to vicars who liked to sort of see how busy they were by the number of funerals in that previous week. Well, that was earlier in this narrative story. They'd all been arguing about who was the greatest. And on that occasion, Jesus, sitting down, he called the 12 to him and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all." So it appears to me that the disciples still haven't got it. But before we scoff at James and John and the other disciples for not getting it, I wonder if we have more in common with them than we would like to admit. James and John and the other disciples, so when I say James and John, let's think of the whole 12, they had a misunderstanding of what Jesus' mission was about. And maybe that reflects sometimes our misunderstanding of what Jesus' mission was all about. They had a desire for positions of honor and power. And sometimes that sort of is like society around us, in business, in government, and sometimes even in church, where status, success, and personal ambition are the priority. But this can overshadow the deeper call to discipleship, service, and sacrifice that Jesus emphasized. So James and John had a misplaced focus on power and status. They sought positions of glory, seats at his right and his left in his kingdom. So can this be paralleled with modern desires for prestige, success, and influence? Often in worldly terms, we see somebody who is successful, and we think that maybe they've been blessed in some way. And maybe that was how the Jewish communities saw it in those days. But that's not how Jesus saw it, and neither is it how he sees it today. Not only were the disciples had a focus on power and status, they were focused on the glory of Jesus' reign. They were expecting him as they went into Jerusalem to be their king, to overthrow the Romans. Not that there should be, at the end of it, suffering. So Jesus challenges them, and he challenges us as well. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I've been baptized with? That points to the suffering, the sacrifice that true discipleship involves. Likewise, in modern times, especially in affluent societies like ours in the Western world, there can be a tendency to emphasize comfort, security, and convenience over sacrificial nature of following Christ. And Tudor touched on this last week in his talk about the rich young man. Well, perhaps James and John envisaged Jesus' kingdom as one of political power and earthly rule. But Jesus had consistently taught that his kingdom is not of this world, that true greatness comes through humble service, not domination or coercion. So Jesus has contrasted James and John's desire for glory with the model of servant leadership, teaching that instead, so he turns it completely round, instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' response to the disciples was to correct their desire for glory, explaining that his kingdom was about servanthood, not status. So their misunderstanding serves as a warning to us and a challenge to us. Jesus' response to them highlights the necessity of servant leadership. It reminds us that his kingdom is not about our personal advancement or worldly status, but about sacrificial love and service. So let's consider what it means to follow Christ. Let's think about that model of discipleship that Jesus portrays, that involves humility, service to others. James and John came to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Jesus simply responded, "What do you want me to do for you?" Well, what would your answer be? What would you want me to do for you? If your answer is to receive power and status and everything that accompanies these, then perhaps you're on the wrong journey. If your answer is to be a servant of and for Christ, well then let's continue this journey with Jesus Christ, imitating his humility and love, living not for ourselves, but for God and for others. The Christian life is one of loving service as we follow Jesus, his example of laying down his life for the sake of others. If your answer is that you're not sure, then read the rest of chapter 10, because in the next few verses, Jesus asks the same question of the blind man, Bartimaeus. What do you want me to do for you? Perhaps your answer could be as simple as Bartimaeus's. Lord, I want to see. Amen.